Today I wanted to just talk very briefly about the suppression of anger in our society, um, which is a legacy of colonisation by the British. Uh, and with this anger suppression, someone who has had their human rights infringed, it's it's a natural thing to express anger. Where it becomes aggression or violence is where, rather than just talking about the behaviour that's been infringed, uh, there's a personal attack on the other person. And it's this understanding that anger is bad that has enabled human rights infringements to rampage. And it's only become clear to me as the events of the past few years where I have not had the appropriate treatment through an ACC counsellor. Um, I was released from compulsory treatment with no money, no benefit, no car, um, no phone, wearing clothes that were borrowed, and the the responses I've had to those complaints have been um, dismissive and disdainful and completely inadequate. And so, like probably others watching this, one would assume the watchdog organisations. There's the Health and Disability Commissioner in New Zealand, Human Rights Commissioner, and the Ombudsman. Well, it's interesting because what is becoming increasingly apparent is these organisations are staffed by people who don't have clinical or legal experience, even though they say they have. Possibly they've done some in house training. And I can say that because their responses show their lack of knowledge, show their lack of professionalism. And I don't know if this is across all health conditions, but it's extremely concerning that it is operating with people who are already vulnerable and who can easily have their liberty restrained under the guise of violence, which in reality is righteous anger for being treated appallingly. And we're starting to see the same pattern flow into justice as well. And maybe it's always been there in justice. I don't have experience of that. But in the quasi judicial tribunals, the same lack of following due legal process of ascertaining the truthfulness of the defendant or the complainant and mitigating any decision by how truthful people have been. So, on one hand, one could say, well, perhaps it's just a cost cutting measure that we have people who are inadequate to the task doing very crucial watchdog functions. Um, But I remember from my time in corrections that very young, inexperienced intern psychologists, largely white, middle class young women, were placed in high intensity rehabilitation programs. And there's particularly one very, um, he'd been in the system for a long time and he was a life prisoner and was matched with this new intern for psychological support and in the group. And it's just inappropriate to be doing that. Anyone with a clinical background would understand that complex trauma, complex violence, ingrained behaviours need someone with a lot of experience and flexibility, because often what is presented is not actually the truth of how this person is as a person, which is also true, of course, for people outside of the criminal law, as I've been finding out. Um, so I've written about this, how this positioning of the victim by the perpetrator as violent or as to blame. And to me, there's a systemic strategy here to do the same thing. Um, you've probably already heard me talk about how the Royal Commission into Abusive Care is led by someone who there is evidence that she has misused her judicial powers. Um, and what we need to ask is, why is this? Why is this happening? What is the purpose of it? And I can only see that it is to maintain power, to avoid responsibility for harms that have been done, and to avoid actually helping um, uh, equip people to be full members of society. People who are stuck in a post traumatic stress loop um, are unable to thrive. Their relationships suffer. Uh, Eventually, authority issues at work, if they're able to keep employment. Um, Almost nobody released from prison or from a mental institution is assessed as being needing of a supported living allowance. Mostly they are pushed on to a job seeker benefit, which is completely inappropriate. And uh, evidence from a psychiatrist who's saying, oh, we do that because that's how WINS does things. Well, actually, that's inappropriate professionally to be delivering your clients to a flawed system. So here's an example of some righteous anger. Um, so what I'm doing is I'm naming the wrongs. I'm not saying that that woman is blah 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 or blah blah blah. In fact, within me, I'm trying to understand, why on earth would someone who has trained to help people be behaving like this? It just doesn't make sense to me. Um, So I think I'm just going to pause because I've had a thought. So what I was thinking about yesterday was in these tenancy disputes, what is not happening is the tenancy tribunal is not looking at who made the initial breach, which is basic contract law, that the first person that breaches the agreement actually makes the contract null and void. But what tends to happen after that is the other party will take action in response to that first breach. And it's the same with these complaints. We don't actually go back to what was the first breach. We focus on the behaviour of the complainant as aggressive or um, what does one woman say? I hope that our chat will be friendly. Well, frankly, when you've infringed someone's human rights, it's very hard for them to feel friendly about it. And why should they? So maybe part of this time is for us as a culture to have a different relationship with anger that is healthy, because we are all different. And in intimate relationships, conflict, the appropriate communication around conflict actually strengthens relationships. And I saw that in the group with the men that I worked with, that the process initially was difficult for them to practice because it was so foreign. But over time, what we saw was they were much more understanding of each other and much more open to hearing why someone behaved that way. In fact, there was a potential riot situation where a white guy had made a racist remark intended to be inflammatory. And what happened afterwards was when we talked about it in the group and suggested maybe it would be good to go and ask this man why he'd done that. And what followed was this very high ranked gang member did that. And to me, that's what we're missing out on, is an understanding of why people behave in the ways that they do. And sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's reactive to something that they're not conscious of. Sometimes it's for their own benefit, and it's very hard to resolve that kind of conflict when someone is not open to resolution. But and maybe that's what we're facing with these government services. Actually, they don't want things to change. And maybe it's good for us as a society to see that clearly, have that laid out clearly, and then um, as a voting population, you can make clearer choices about, is this how you want society to run? And is this how we want to treat people who first were victims by the state often? And so, anyway, some thoughts about the unhealthiness of our culture of suppressing anger.